Welcome to Sleepy Centuries, and tonight we'll be talking about the long, winding story of the First World War. A war that touched every corner of the world, one that began with whispers, grew with thunder, and ended in silence. So, settle in, close your eyes, let your breath slow, and come with us back to a century ago, to the sleepy, tangled roots of a war that changed the world. It began with silence, the kind that doesn't seem ominous at first. Just the quiet hum of summer in Europe, the soft ticking of clocks in marble halls, the rustle of newspapers in cafes, the distant rhythm of horses' hooves on cobblestone streets. The year was 1914, and the continent was alive with confidence, ambition, and a strange, uneasy calm. The kind of calm that settles in before a storm breaks, before history pivots, and everything familiar begins to change. It was a world on the brink, though very few knew it. There was music in the air, jazz in Paris, waltzes in Vienna, and endless movement. Trains roared across borders with little restriction. Telegrams flew from city to city, and monarchs wrote to one another in cousinly tones. It was a world where the old and the new coexisted uneasily, where empires still clung to the 19th century's illusions of glory, but new technologies and ideas were already reshaping the bones beneath the skin of the age. The people of Europe were living in what some would later call the last golden summer, in the capitals of the great powers: London, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Vienna. There was a feeling of progress, of endless possibility. Factories were working overtime, ships crossed oceans carrying goods and passengers faster than ever before, and cities bloomed with electric lights, telephones, and automobiles. It was the twilight of the old world order, but no one could yet see how fast that light would fade. In Britain, the empire stretched around the globe, sun never setting on its red territories. France still basked in the ideals of its revolutionary past, proud and wary. Germany, young and newly powerful, brimmed with industrial strength and a sense of destiny. Russia brooded beneath the weight of its own contradictions, a vast empire with deep poverty and an increasingly restless population. Austria-Hungary, meanwhile, was a fragile patchwork of ethnicities and loyalties, held together by ceremony and old imperial glue. And beneath this glittering surface, tensions simmered. Nationalism was rising across Europe, like steam from a kettle left too long on the stove. Countries were arming themselves, not just defensively, but ambitiously. Armies swelled in size, not because anyone expected a war, but because each nation wanted to be ready, just in case. Military alliances were quietly drawn, binding nations into webs of promises, some public, many secret. The Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy stood opposite the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain. These were not yet enemies, but they were wary watchers of one another, waiting for something to shift the balance. It was an age of diplomacy and deception, of champagne toasts and quiet espionage. The leaders of Europe, many of whom were related by blood, King George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, exchanged letters and photographs, while their generals updated invasion plans behind closed doors. At royal weddings, alliances were smiled into place. At conferences, they were whispered and sketched in the margins. The sense of certainty was strong, but it was built on a fragile foundation. The people believed in their nation's strength, in progress, in a future brighter than the past. They had faith in civilization, in culture, in kings and presidents and ministers. They did not know how fast those beliefs could be tested or broken. In the Balkans, the fragile southeastern edge of Europe, things were less peaceful. It was a region riddled with ethnic tensions, political assassinations, and crumbling empires. Serbia had emerged as a rising power, full of pride and ambition, deeply resented by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which feared losing control over its Slavic territories. There, resentment simmered hotter than in the salons of Paris or the drawing rooms of Berlin. The Balkans had already been called the powder keg of Europe, and with good reason. Wars had broken out in the region even before the Great War, drawing lines and leaving wounds. Most of Europe thought these were minor scuffles, distractions at best. But a spark, once lit in dry grass, does not ask where it came from. It only spreads. Still, in the summer of 1914, none of this seemed urgent. People were going about their lives. Children played in parks. Poets wrote verses in cafes. Soldiers drilled in sunlight, not knowing what kind of orders would soon come. Farmers harvested wheat. Lovers met beneath trees. All across Europe, life continued, and the silence endured. The stock markets moved steadily. Newspapers were full of stories, some political, many trivial. Even those who sensed something approaching could not imagine the scale of it. There had been wars before, brief, bloody conflicts between powers. But this would be something else. No one imagined a war that would stretch over 4 years, claim tens of millions of lives, reshape continents, and redraw the human experience itself. In those warm early days of summer, people believed the world made sense. That reason would prevail. That diplomacy, trade, and shared culture would keep the great powers from tipping into chaos. They believed the 20th century would be an age of progress, of peace, of modern marvels, and scientific wonder, and perhaps it still could have been. But history does not always follow the neat path people hope it will. It curls, it turns, it waits, and then it moves, quietly, at first, and then all at once. On a warm morning in late June, in a city most Europeans barely thought about, a procession made its way through the streets. Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, was still waking, its stone buildings glowing under the summer sun. Carriages clattered on narrow roads, and people leaned from windows or gathered on sidewalks, curious and excited. They had come to catch a glimpse of royalty. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had come for a visit, accompanied by his wife, Sophie. The couple had decided to appear in public together, a rare gesture, a symbol of affection and quiet defiance, for Sophie had long been excluded from many official duties due to her lower rank. But today, they rode together in an open car, smiling at the gathered crowd, unaware that history had begun to close in around them. The streets of Sarajevo were tight, the route winding and imperfectly planned. The Archduke's presence was both ceremonial and political. Bosnia, recently annexed by Austria-Hungary, was a tense region, its people divided between loyalties to empire and to the idea of a free Slavic nation. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, especially among nationalist groups determined to break free of imperial rule. That morning, in the crowd, hidden among the ordinary citizens, were several young men, members of a secret group known as the Black Hand. They were armed, angry, and desperate. They believed that violence could change the course of history. Most of them were little more than teenagers, united by a dream of Serbian independence, trained loosely, driven by idealism and illness. Several were already dying from tuberculosis. They had nothing to lose. The first attempt on the Archduke's life came quickly. A bomb, thrown by one of the conspirators, bounced off the folded-down roof of the car and rolled under the vehicle behind it. It exploded there, injuring several officers and bystanders. Panic broke out, but Franz Ferdinand insisted on continuing with the day's events, shaken but not retreating. He was angry but composed, refusing to show fear. He and Sophie carried on with the planned reception, making speeches, attending ceremonies. It was as if they believed the danger had passed. But the city had changed. Tension now curled through the streets like smoke. Windows that had been thrown open were now shut. The air felt different, thicker, heavier, electric. Later that morning, a decision was made to alter the route for the couple's return, to avoid the areas where the attack had occurred. But the driver, unaware of the change, turned onto a previously planned road and had to stop abruptly. And there, standing on the sidewalk, almost by accident, was Gavrilo Princip. He had gone to buy a sandwich, believing his mission had failed, the day already lost. But in that moment, with the car halted in front of him, everything he had dreamed and feared collided with terrifying clarity. He stepped forward, raised a small pistol, and fired 2 shots. The first struck Sophie. She slumped beside her husband. The second pierced Franz Ferdinand's neck. As the car sped away, both were dying. The Archduke whispered to his wife, urging her to live for their children, unaware that she was already gone. He repeated, again and again, "It's nothing, it's nothing," but it was everything. The assassination was not simply the murder of 2 people. It was the spark that would ignite the most destructive war the world had ever seen. Yet even then, it did not seem inevitable. In the hours and days that followed, the world held its breath. Austria-Hungary was enraged, but cautious. It suspected Serbian involvement, and perhaps rightly so, as elements within the Serbian military had known of the plot, even if the government had not officially endorsed it. The Austrians demanded justice, and with Germany's encouragement, they prepared an ultimatum, a list of demands so severe it seemed impossible for Serbia to accept them all. And yet, Serbia did try. It agreed to most of the terms, but Austria-Hungary, eager to assert its power and fearful of appearing weak, declared war anyway. What might have remained a local conflict, a brief, punitive campaign, began to widen almost immediately. Russia, protector of the Slavic people, moved to support Serbia. Germany, tied by alliance and ambition, mobilized in turn. France, drawn in by treaty and by fear of encirclement, followed. Britain hesitated, then joined, partly out of obligation, partly to maintain the balance of power in Europe. The chain of alliances, carefully constructed over decades, now acted like a series of gears locking into place, each pulling the next. None of the great powers had expected war to begin this way, over a single assassination. Many believed it would pass quickly, a summer campaign followed by treaties and repairs. They thought armies would meet on open fields, as they had in wars past, and that the world would soon return to order. But this war would be different. It would dig in, stretch out, and refuse to end. The shot fired by Gavrilo Princip echoed louder than any had imagined, not just across Sarajevo, not just across Austria-Hungary, but across the entire globe. In that single, staggering moment, an empire lost its air, a continent lost its balance, and the modern world began to tilt toward catastrophe. The assassination in Sarajevo was not the war itself, but it was the breath before the plunge, the breaking point in a world already too tightly wound. And though the world would never again be as it was on the morning of June 28, 1914, few understood, even as the funeral bells rang, just how completely the future had already been rewritten. They marched off to war in uniforms still stiff with fresh fabric, with buttons polished to a gleam, and rifles slung confidently over their shoulders. The streets of Europe rang with cheers and music, as young men boarded trains beneath banners and waving flags. There were parades, brass bands, flowers tossed from balconies. In Berlin, Paris, Vienna, and London, crowds gathered in a strange mood of celebration and solemnity, as though history had sent out invitations to a grand affair. Many believed it would be over in a few weeks. "Home by Christmas" was a phrase spoken in every language. It was a phrase that would come to haunt the millions who said it, whispered it, believed it, because no one truly understood what kind of war they were walking into. Once the initial movement of troops was complete, the war did something unexpected. It stopped moving. By the end of 1914, after months of rapid advances and fierce battles, the Western Front, the line that stretched from the North Sea down through Belgium and France, had become something the world had never quite seen before. Neither side could break through. Armies dug into the ground, carving deep trenches through fields and forests. These were not simple ditches, but vast systems of fortifications, with fire steps, sandbags, duckboards, barbed wire, and bunkers. From above, they looked like scars across the land, jagged, dark lines crisscrossing open countryside. Inside these trenches, soldiers lived day after day, week after week, month after month. Rain turned the floors to mud, snow turned the world to ice, and the sun baked everything in thick, clinging heat. Rats the size of cats scurried between packs and rations. Lice-infested clothes, never fully gone, no matter how often uniforms were washed or burned. The smell was a constant blend of sweat, unwashed bodies, gunpowder, and rot. Latrines were dug quickly and filled faster. Sleep came in short bursts, often interrupted by the crack of a rifle or the whistle of a shell, and through it all, the men waited. They waited through long, bitter nights, listening for the sounds of enemy movement just meters away. They waited for orders, for letters from home, for dry socks, for fresh food, for anything to break the monotony. Boredom was a daily enemy, perhaps more persistent than the opposing army. And yet, even within that grim routine, life continued. Men played cards, told stories, wrote poetry. They carved small objects from wood or shell casings. They sang songs in quiet voices, sometimes loud enough to reach the enemy trenches, where soldiers in a different language hummed back their own tunes. In moments like these, the war felt absurd, surreal. Two armies staring at each other across a strip of blasted earth, neither able to advance, neither willing to retreat. That strip of land between trenches became known as no man's land. It was a place of devastation and death, littered with shattered trees, broken bodies, and the remnants of failed attacks. Crossing it meant exposure to machine guns, snipers, and hidden artillery. When assaults were ordered, they often began with an artillery barrage, thousands of shells screaming through the sky, intended to break the enemy line. Then came the whistle, the command to go. Over the top, soldiers climbed out of their trenches and ran forward, bayonets fixed, through wire, mud, and smoke. They were met with deadly precision, because the defenders, protected and waiting, had all the advantage. Progress was measured in yards. Victories came at terrible cost. A few hundred meters gained might cost thousands of lives. The Battle of the Somme, one of the largest of the war, began in July 1916. On the first day alone, the British suffered more than 57, 0 casualties. That was a single day. And the battle would continue for months, dragging into November, for a total gain of about 6 miles. Names like Verdun, Passchendaele, and Ypres would become etched in memory, synonymous not with glory but with endurance, futility, and suffering. Yet somehow, the lines held. Despite the slaughter, despite the horror, soldiers returned to the trenches, rebuilt what had been destroyed, and prepared for the next order. Courage in this war was not always about charging forward. Sometimes it was simply about staying where you were, standing watch in freezing rain, holding a position as shells fell around you. It was the courage of perseverance, of loyalty to comrades, of facing another dawn with boots full of water and fear in your throat. Back home, the news filtered through slowly. Censorship was tight, and the reality of the trenches was often hidden beneath patriotic slogans and carefully crafted reports. Families received letters written with cheer and modesty, rarely betraying the horror. Soldiers often spared their loved ones the truth. They described shared meals, small comforts, the sound of birds in the morning. The deeper pain was kept between the lines, in the space where ink ran thin and silence lingered. And still, recruitment continued. Posters called for brave men to join the fight. PALs, battalions, units formed from friends, co-workers, and neighbors went off together. In many towns, a single day's battle could wipe out an entire generation. But at home, the need to believe in purpose, in righteousness, in eventual victory kept spirits high, at least for a time. As 1915 turned to 1916, and then to 1917, the war became something both sides could not escape. It was no longer a campaign. It had become a condition of life. New weapons were introduced. Poison gas drifted silently across the lines, its effects horrifying and unpredictable. Tanks rumbled slowly into the field, uncertain but menacing. Airplanes flew above, first as scouts, then as bombers. Yet despite every innovation, the trenches remained, unchanged in their grim reality. The soldiers who lived in them developed rituals. They learned the sounds of incoming fire, the pattern of enemy patrols, the quiet between bombardments. They trusted the small comforts: tea heated over a flame, the sound of mail being handed out, a fresh pair of socks from a Red Cross parcel. They learned to grieve quietly and carry on, to joke through fear, to name the rats and talk to them as companions. They survived, not just the bullets, but the weight of waiting. For some, the war would end in those trenches, buried where they fell. For others, it would never truly end, the memories carried home in silence. And outside the trenches, the world was slowly waking to the realization that this war was not ending soon. The front lines were not moving, and every plan for a quick victory had failed. The powers of Europe were now locked in something far deeper, far more terrible than they had imagined. It was a stalemate of steel and suffering, and no one yet knew how, or when, it would finally break. The war that began with horses and bayonets quickly transformed into something no one had truly prepared for. It became a war of machines, of inventions born not from a spirit of wonder, but from desperation, from the desire to kill more efficiently, to break the deadlock, to force a way through the mud and wire. The First World War became the testing ground for technology's darkest potential. Where once soldiers stood eye to eye with their enemies, now they faced death from miles away, from weapons too large to imagine and too impersonal to see. The battlefield was no longer simply a place of bravery or strategy. It became an assembly line of destruction, fed by science, steel, and smoke. Artillery was the first and most relentless of these new machines. Massive guns, often mounted miles behind the front lines, fired shells the size of small boats. Some could launch a payload over 20 miles, and their explosions reshaped the land entirely. Forests disappeared, villages became craters, hills were flattened, valleys erased. The noise of a major bombardment was unlike anything heard before, a rolling thunder that could last for days, shaking the earth, deafening the men in its path, and leaving behind a wasteland that seemed almost lunar in its emptiness. The shells didn't just tear apart bodies, they tore apart minds. Soldiers spoke of the trembling in their bones, the way the air itself seemed to ripple and break. Some would be found later, uninjured but wide-eyed and mute, shaking uncontrollably, victims of what would come to be known as shell shock. But artillery was only one part of the new face of war. Machine guns, with their chattering, relentless fire, changed the dynamics of combat forever. A single team of 2 or 3 men could hold off hundreds. These guns did not pause, did not hesitate. They turned charges into slaughter, waves of men into fallen silence. Traditional tactics, mass formations, frontal assaults, were suddenly suicidal. But generals, raised in older wars, struggled to adapt. Orders were given, and men went forward, only to fall in neat, terrible rows before they ever reached enemy lines. The machine gun did not blink, it did not grow tired, it did not distinguish between officer and private. It was one of the many signs that the human body was no longer the measure of strength on the battlefield. Power had moved to the mechanical, and then came the gas, a silent, creeping terror that floated low across the trenches, carried by wind and fear. First used by the Germans at Ypres in 1915, chlorine gas rolled in like a greenish mist, stinging the eyes and burning the lungs. Men coughed violently, gasped for air, and fell to the ground, unable to breathe. Later, other gases followed: phosgene, more potent still, and then mustard gas, which lingered in the soil and blistered the skin. Gas masks were hurriedly developed, distributed, and worn like lifelines, but nothing could fully stop the horror of gas. The wind could shift suddenly, a mask could fail, and even those who survived a gas attack might carry its damage for life: scarred lungs, burned eyes, a voice that never fully returned. The gas didn't care who it touched. It seeped into every crevice, turned air itself into an enemy. It was one of the most feared weapons of the war, not because it killed more than bullets, but because of the way it killed, slowly, silently, invisibly. As the trenches grew deeper and the war grew longer, Both sides turned to new inventions in search of a breakthrough. One of the most iconic was the tank. Born out of necessity and frustration, the first tanks were little more than armored boxes on tracks, slow, lumbering, and prone to break down. But they were powerful. They could crush barbed wire, cross trenches, and provide shelter from machine gun fire. The first appearance of tanks on the battlefield startled even the soldiers who used them. They rumbled forward like metal beasts, breathing smoke, bullets bouncing harmlessly from their sides. At first, they were few in number and unreliable, but over time they became more sophisticated, more reliable, and more feared. The tank did not end trench warfare, but it pointed toward a future where mobility and protection could be joined, where war would move again. The sky, too, became a battlefield. When the war began, airplanes were a novelty, biplanes made of wood and canvas, used mostly for reconnaissance. Pilots flew above the trenches, mapping enemy positions, observing troop movements. But it wasn't long before pilots began to carry pistols, then rifles, and eventually machine guns. Dogfights, twisting, turning duels in the clouds, captured the imagination of the public, and flying aces like the Red Baron became household names. But even the romance of flight was swallowed by the grim logic of war. Bombers were developed to strike behind enemy lines. Cities, once far from the front, were now within reach of destruction from the air. Zeppelins floated over London, dropping bombs in the night. For the first time in history, no place felt entirely safe. War had taken to the sky. Beneath the sea, another war unfolded, cold, quiet, and deadly. Submarines, especially the German U-boats, prowled the Atlantic, striking without warning. Merchant ships were torpedoed, and crews rarely had time to escape. The sea, once a space of distance and trade, became a graveyard. One of the most infamous attacks was the sinking of the RMS Lusitania in 1915, a civilian ship torpedoed off the coast of Ireland with the loss of over 1,000 lives. Among them were American citizens, and the attack helped to turn public opinion in the United States. Submarine warfare, like so much else in this new kind of conflict, was total. It blurred the line between combatant and civilian, between front and home. Each of these machines, the guns, the gas, the tanks, the planes, the submarines, emerged from a war that demanded more and more from its combatants. Human strength alone was no longer enough. The battlefield had become an industrial space, where factories far from the front were just as essential as the men in uniform. Coal, oil, steel, and rubber were as valuable as strategy. Scientists became weapons designers. Engineers became generals in their own right. The war had begun with horses and cavalry charges. It would end with engines, chemicals, and machines that moved faster than the human eye could follow. But the machines did not make the war easier. They made it longer, more complex, more devastating. They took away the illusion of honor and replaced it with the cold efficiency of numbers. Tons of shells fired, meters gained, lives lost. The battlefield became a system, a calculation, a process. And in that process, millions were caught. The soldiers of this war did not simply fight with bravery, they endured technology itself. They lived beneath its weight, faced it daily, slept beside it, and sometimes died without ever touching the hand of another person. The age of mechanized warfare had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. The machines had arrived, and the world, once green, quiet, and full of flags, was now wrapped in smoke, scarred by steel, and humming with the sound of progress turned to ash. The war that had started in Europe did not stay there. Though the first shots were exchanged on the continent, the echoes traveled much farther, across mountains and oceans, deserts and jungles, across every border the empires had drawn over the centuries. It spread like ink on wet paper, pulled by the lines of colonial control, by treaties signed in quieter times, by ambition, by fear, and by necessity. Soon, it wasn't just a European war. It was a world war in the truest sense, drawing in people from every corner of the globe, many of whom had never seen a map of Europe. much less imagine dying in its muddy fields. This was not a war of choice for many. It was duty, expectation, or the simple grip of empire. From India, nearly 1.5 million men joined the British war effort. They came from villages and cities, from the Himalayas to the southern coasts, dressed first in the warm colors of home, later in the drab khaki of military issue. Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, shoulder to shoulder in muddy trenches thousands of miles from where they had been born. Many had never seen snow, or heard the harsh cries of European birds, or felt the damp chill of northern winters. Yet they served with loyalty, often with distinction, many earning medals for bravery. Letters home described not just the fighting, but the strangeness of the land, the cold that sank deep into their bones, the food they did not recognize, and the aching distance from families left behind. Some wrote poems, some never wrote again. In Africa, the war became a new kind of battlefield. German colonies, Togoland, Cameroon, German East Africa, were contested fiercely. The British, French, and Belgian forces, often composed of African soldiers under colonial command, fought across plains and jungles. These were not the grand battles of Europe, but long, grinding campaigns that devastated local populations. Villages were razed, crops seized, and people displaced. Over 2 million Africans were used as porters, carrying supplies across impossible terrain. Many died of exhaustion, disease, or starvation. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories lost beneath the weight of empire. Yet without them, the war effort in Africa would have collapsed. Australia and New Zealand, tied to Britain by blood and culture, answered the call to arms swiftly. Thousands volunteered within days, eager to prove themselves, to defend the motherland. Their journey led them not first to Europe, but to Gallipoli, a narrow strip of Turkish coastline that would become a name etched into national memory. There, in 1915, the Anzac forces landed as part of a British-led attempt to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. What followed was months of brutal stalemate, fought on cliffs and ravines, in baking heat and under constant fire. The campaign failed, but the legend of Gallipoli grew, of courage, resilience, and sacrifice. The soldiers who fought there left behind more than bodies. They left behind the first pieces of independent identity, a sense that Australia and New Zealand were more than just distant parts of the empire. The Ottoman Empire, once mighty and now fading, found itself pulled into the conflict by alliance with Germany. The war gave it a chance to strike against old rivals, Russia in the Caucasus, Britain in the Middle East, but it also led to one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Fearing rebellion and betrayal, the Ottoman leadership turned against its Armenian population, accusing them of collusion with the Russians. What followed was systematic deportation, execution, and starvation, what the world would come to know as the Armenian Genocide. Over 1 million men, women, and children were killed or forced into the desert to die. It was a crime largely hidden at the time, overshadowed by the chaos of global war, but its shadow stretches forward still. Meanwhile, Japan, allied with Britain, used the war as an opportunity to expand its influence in the Pacific. It seized German territories, Qingdao in China, islands in Micronesia, and strengthened its naval power. Though its direct involvement in Europe was limited, the war gave Japan a platform to assert itself on the world stage and planted the seeds of future ambitions. In China, too, thousands of laborers, the Chinese Labor Corps, were sent to Europe to support the Allies. They dug trenches, unloaded cargo, repaired roads. They were not soldiers, but they served on the front lines of logistics, often in dangerous conditions. Their contribution was vast, their recognition small. And then, across the Atlantic, there was the United States. In 1914, it watched from a distance. President Woodrow Wilson vowed neutrality, and many Americans agreed. The war, they believed, was a European problem, rooted in old rivalries and dynastic squabbles. But neutrality proved difficult. American ships still sailed, American banks still loaned money, and German submarines, unseen, underwater, began to target all enemy shipping. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, with over 100 American passengers aboard, shocked the public, but still, the country hesitated. It wasn't until 1917, when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and attempted to draw Mexico into an alliance against the US, that the tide turned. America entered the war, not just with soldiers, but with factories, food, and optimism. When American troops finally arrived in Europe, they were well-fed, well-equipped, and untested. They brought a new kind of energy to the war, a belief that it could be won. Their numbers grew quickly, reinforcing exhausted French and British lines. They fought at Belleau Wood, at Saint-Mihiel, in the Meuse-Argonne. They learned quickly. They bled. They changed the balance. But America's contribution wasn't just military. It was psychological. For the Allies, it signaled that the end might be possible. For the Central Powers, it was a final blow to hope. As more nations joined, the line between soldier and civilian blurred further. On the home front, war became a part of everyday life. Food was rationed, factories were converted, propaganda spread through newspapers and posters. In Canada, women took up jobs in munitions, plants. In South Africa, labor strikes were suppressed in the name of unity. In Ireland, rebellion flared with the Easter Rising, a reminder that war could not silence every voice. In every nation, the war touched families, through absence, through grief, through the slow erosion of certainty. The world that had once been large had become small, interconnected by conflict. No sea was safe, no continent untouched. The war had reached beyond the battlefield and into the daily rhythm of life, into trade routes and school lessons, into food supplies and political speeches. Empires called on their colonies, and the colonies answered, some with loyalty, some with hope for future freedom, some with the simple knowledge that they had no real choice. In doing so, they tied their futures to the outcome of a war they had not started. By 1917, more than 30 nations were involved. The war had become a global engine, pulling in people, resources, and dreams from every direction. It was no longer a European war with foreign allies. It was a world war, in scope, in reach, and in consequence. And though it would end one day, the world that emerged would carry its marks forever. In borders redrawn, in wounds both visible and unseen, in the quiet stories passed down across generations, the world had joined the war. But when it was finally over, it would be the war that had joined the world. Far from the mud-soaked trenches and battle-scarred fields, another war was being fought, quieter, but no less relentless. It was the war of waiting, of coping, of surviving not bullets or gas, but the long, slow ache of absence. For those who remained behind, life during the First World War was defined by uncertainty. Letters from the front arrived weeks late, if they arrived at all. Newspapers printed casualty lists in columns too long to read in one sitting. Telegrams brought dread. A knock at the door could change everything. Mothers, wives, fathers, and children lived in a strange, suspended world, half in the present, half in fear of what news tomorrow might bring. The battlefields may have been far away, but the war seeped into kitchens and schoolrooms, into churches and factories, into every part of everyday life. In the cities, the rhythm of life shifted almost overnight. Men left their jobs, their families, their neighborhoods. Streets felt emptier, trains quieter, shops more subdued. And into those spaces stepped women, by the thousands. They filled the roles once considered closed to them, becoming bus conductors, postal workers, police officers, welders, mechanics, and, perhaps most crucially, munitions workers. In the great factories of Britain, France, Germany, and beyond, women labored day and night to produce the shells, bullets, and weapons that fed the war machine. Their hands stained yellow from chemicals, their hair tucked beneath scarves. They worked with a quiet resolve. It was dangerous work. Explosions in munitions plants claimed many lives, yet the factories never stopped. They couldn't, Without them, the front would fall silent, not from peace, but from failure. In rural areas, war came in the form of labor shortages. With so many men gone, farms struggled to plant, harvest, and maintain livestock. Women, elderly farmers, and even children took on roles that once belonged to sons and fathers. Governments organized land armies, urging civilians to dig, plant, and raise food. Victory gardens sprang up in cities and towns. Every potato mattered, every egg, every hand that could work the soil was called upon. And still, there was never quite enough. Rationing crept into daily life like a slow tide. Butter, flour, sugar, meat, all measured carefully, stretched as far as they could go. Families learned to do without. New recipes emerged, shaped not by flavor, but by necessity. Substitutes became common: dried milk, margarine, barley bread. Meals were no longer simple acts of nourishment. They were expressions of endurance. The act of feeding one's family became an act of quiet resistance, a way to hold together what the war was trying to unravel. Even in neutral countries, the effects of the war were felt. Trade routes were disrupted, inflation soared, industries shifted focus, and tensions rose. In nations like Switzerland and Sweden, shortages and protests emerged despite their official non-involvement. For many, neutrality did not mean escape. It meant navigating an increasingly hostile world with fewer resources and growing anxiety. Across the empire, cities, and colonized lands, the war transformed expectations and identities. In Canada and Australia, women began organizing not just for war work, but for suffrage. They pointed to their labor, their sacrifice, and asked for recognition. In British India, where men fought and died in Europe, families waited for wages, pensions, and promises of reform that would not come. The home front was not uniform. It was complex, layered with class, race, gender, and geography. But everywhere, people were being reshaped by grief, by hardship, by hope, and by the long, silent wait. Children grew up in the shadow of war. In some cities, gas masks were distributed to schools. In others, air raids forced classes to be cancelled or relocated. War toys became common: model tanks, miniature rifles, tiny uniforms. Some children helped collect scrap metal. Others wrote letters to fathers they barely remembered. They learned to read from war-themed books, sang patriotic songs, and grew up believing that sacrifice was a part of normal life. For some, childhood became a mirror of the battlefield, full of rituals and language shaped by violence they didn't fully understand. In the evenings, lights were dimmed or blacked out entirely. In coastal towns, windows were covered, and sirens wailed when enemy ships or airships approached. The Zeppelin raids on London brought war directly to the civilian population in a way Europe had never seen. Bombs fell not on soldiers, but on homes. Panic spread. Families huddled in basements or underground stations. There was no front line anymore, just an ever-growing sense that no place was truly safe. And through it all, people tried to live. Couples married quickly, fearing there might not be time later. Some fell in love by letter alone, never meeting before engagement. Births rose briefly, then fell. The rhythm of life grew jagged and unpredictable. Churches remained full, not just for services, but for silence. Prayer and mourning became daily rituals. Cemeteries expanded. Memorials were quietly planned, even as the war still raged. Everywhere, small acts of kindness and community appeared. Neighbors helped one another. Strangers shared news, food, grief. People found strength in the familiar: a favorite tea, a Sunday walk, the sound of a piano played through a thin apartment wall. These moments became lifelines, reminders of the world before, and of the possibility that something like peace might return. But for many, the war also bred bitterness. As years dragged on, optimism faded. Protests flared in factories. Strikes were called. In Germany, starvation and cold gripped the population as the British naval blockade tightened its hold. In Russia, bread lines stretched for blocks. In Britain and France, War weariness crept into conversations once full of resolve. People began to ask, quietly at first, then more loudly, why the war continued, what it was truly for, and whether anything could justify the mounting losses. Politicians struggled to maintain support. Newspapers walked a fine line between patriotism and censorship, and all the while, the wounded returned in silence. Some came home with scars, others with missing limbs, and some returned carrying wounds no one could see. Shell shock, what we might now call PTSD, was poorly understood, often dismissed as cowardice. Men who had stared into the face of mechanized death found it impossible to return to the quiet patterns of civilian life. Some wandered, some drank, some never spoke again of what they'd seen. Hospitals filled with the mentally shattered. Families did not know how to help them. Society had no language for what they had endured. Even those untouched by physical loss felt the change. Communities were no longer whole. Streets had missing faces. The world they had known in 1914 had drifted away, piece by piece, replaced by something harder, more uncertain. Yet still, people endured. They adapted. They mourned. And they waited. Because war, for those at home, was not marked by battles or victories. It was measured in time, by the days without letters, the months without news, the years without peace. It was a war of silence, of courage lived in small ways, and for many, it was the most difficult battle of all. In the East, the war was a different creature, entirely. While the Western Front settled into a grinding deadlock, with trenches dug deep into the earth and progress measured in yards, the Eastern Front remained vast, shifting, unpredictable. Here, the land itself played a role in shaping the conflict. Endless forests, broad rivers, frozen plains, and mountain passes. Battles were not confined to narrow corridors, but sprawled across hundreds of miles, engulfing towns and villages, sweeping through territory with a brutal and sweeping momentum. The armies of Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary clashed in engagements far larger in scale than many seen in the West. But the immensity of the Eastern Front masked deep fractures, political, social, and logistical, that were quietly unraveling one of the oldest empires in the world. Russia, the empire of the Tsars, entered the war with the largest army in Europe, millions of soldiers under arms, backed by a sense of national pride and duty to protect fellow Slavs. But numbers could not compensate for the empire's deep flaws. Its economy was stretched thin, its infrastructure was fragile, its command structure bloated and inefficient, and its people were already suffering under the weight of inequality, poverty, and political repression. The Tsar, Nicholas II, believed in his divine right to rule. He saw war as a chance to unite the people under a common cause. But the war did not unify. It exposed everything that was already broken. The Russian army suffered devastating losses in the early years of the conflict. At Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, entire corps were surrounded and annihilated. Communication failed. Supplies ran out. Soldiers went into battle with no rifles, told to wait until their comrades fell and take theirs. Ammunition was scarce. Medical care was primitive. Thousands froze in the winter. Others starved. The Russian soldier endured with remarkable resilience, but morale steadily declined. Desertions rose, rumors spread, and back home, the pressure grew. In the cities, especially Petrograd and Moscow, the war brought economic disaster. Prices soared. Bread and coal became luxuries. Families queued for hours for food that might never arrive. The government responded with repression, cracking down on dissent and censoring the press. But the people's patience was eroding. Workers began to strike. Students protested. Intellectuals whispered of change. The Tsarina, Alexandra, took on increasing power while Nicholas was at the front, and her decisions, guided by the mystic Rasputin, only deepened the crisis. The imperial court seemed distant, almost unreal, to the people struggling to survive on the streets. The divide between ruler and ruled had become a chasm. By early 1917, the strain was unbearable. In February, protests broke out in Petrograd. sparked by food shortages, but quickly escalating into mass demonstrations. Soldiers sent to suppress the crowds began to join them instead. The Duma, Russia's legislative body, turned against the Tsar. Under mounting pressure, Nicholas II abdicated the throne in March. The Romanov dynasty, rulers of Russia for over 300 years, fell in a matter of days. For a moment, it seemed as though a new path might be forged. A provisional government, backed by liberals and moderate socialists, promised reform and a continued commitment to the war effort. But even this fragile hope was short-lived. The war had not ended with the Tsar's departure. The soldiers were still in the trenches, weary and angry. The workers were still hungry. The peasants were still landless. Into this turmoil stepped the Bolsheviks, a revolutionary faction led by Vladimir Lenin. Exiled for years, Lenin returned to Russia with the help of Germany, which saw in him a chance to destabilize its enemy from within. He arrived in April and wasted no time. Peace, land, bread became the rallying cry. The message was simple and irresistible. End the war, redistribute land, feed the people. The Bolsheviks promised not just change, but transformation, and they were willing to seize it by force. Throughout the summer of 1917, Russia spiraled further into chaos. The provisional government struggled to maintain authority. The war effort faltered. The army collapsed into disobedience. In October-November, by the Western calendar, the Bolsheviks launched a coup. It was swift and surgical. They seized key buildings in Petrograd. The Winter Palace fell. The government was overthrown. Lenin declared a new era, a workers' state, guided by revolutionary ideals. And true to their word, the Bolsheviks sought peace. They opened negotiations with Germany almost immediately. The resulting treaty, signed in March 1918 at Brest-Litovsk, was harsh. Russia gave up vast territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and parts of Poland. It was a humiliating loss, but to the Bolsheviks, it was a necessary one. They needed to end the foreign war so they could focus on the civil war now brewing within, red against white, revolutionary against monarchist, neighbor against neighbor. Russia would remain at war, just a different kind, a war of ideas, of visions for the future, soaked in blood and uncertainty. For the wider conflict, Russia's exit changed the balance. Germany could now transfer hundreds of thousands of troops from the east to the Western Front. It was a short-lived advantage, but a dangerous one. The Allies, already strained, now faced a final surge of German force, yet the gamble would ultimately fail, and the absence of Russia from the Allied side reshaped the post-war world. The Bolshevik rise shocked the old powers of Europe. Fear of communism spread like a new contagion. Alliances shifted. The idea that a government could be overthrown from within became a persistent anxiety in every capital. But for Russia itself, the war had never truly ended. The imperial world had collapsed. The revolutionary dream had yet to solidify. In the vacuum, millions would die, not just from bullets, but from famine, disease, and repression. The country had been pulled into the Great War with dreams of unity and pride. It emerged fragmented, exhausted, and uncertain of its place in the new world. The Eastern Front faded from Western memory, often overshadowed by the trenches of France and Belgium, but its scale, its suffering, and its consequences were enormous. It was a front of motion rather than stillness, of revolution rather than stasis. And in the chaos of that vast, shifting conflict, the 20th century was born, not just in the redrawing of borders, but in the rewriting of ideologies. The war in the East did not end with an armistice. It ended with fire and upheaval, with a monarchy overthrown, and a world remade in the image of revolution. By 1918, the war had entered its final, grinding act. But there was no clear path to victory, no decisive turning point that had made it obvious the end was near. The front lines remained much as they had been for years, muddy, battered, and strewn with the weight of countless failed offensives. Yet something was shifting, slowly but undeniably. Beneath the churn of daily reports and bulletins, beneath the stubborn maps that rarely changed, a sense of fatigue was settling into the bones of every nation involved. Soldiers had endured 4 years of relentless strain. Generals had watched plans unravel again and again. Civilians had given more than they had to give. And across the battlefields and cities of Europe, a single question began to echo louder than any artillery barrage. How much longer could this go on? Germany, once the architect of confident, sweeping plans for victory, now found itself backed into a corner. The hope that Russia's withdrawal from the war would turn the tide in the West had faded quickly. Though it allowed Germany to shift over 500,000 troops to the Western Front, time had worked against them. The United States had entered the war with growing strength. Each week, more American soldiers arrived in Europe, fresh, well-fed, undamaged by the years of attrition that had eroded the fighting spirit of so many European units. And they came not as scattered reinforcements, but as an increasingly organized, independent force, with a growing say in how the war would be fought. Germany knew it had to strike before American numbers became overwhelming. In the spring of 1918, they launched a series of desperate offensives, known collectively as the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. It was a final gamble. German stormtroopers, elite and fast-moving, pierced Allied lines with speed and force that stunned their enemies. Towns fell, trenches were overrun. For a moment, it looked as though the years of waiting and bleeding might finally yield a breakthrough. Paris came within reach. The church bells of the French capital were packed in crates, prepared to be taken away before the Germans arrived. But the breakthrough was an illusion. The gains were too fast, too shallow. The German advance stretched their own supply lines to the breaking point. Their troops, underfed and exhausted, could not sustain the momentum. And the Allies, now unified under a single command, led by French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, regrouped quickly and counterattacked with precision and strength. From July onwards, the tide turned, not with spectacle, but with a steady, unrelenting push. The 100 Days Offensive began, and with it came the slow collapse of Germany's hopes. Town by town, trench by trench, the Allies advanced. The German army began to retreat, not in panic, but in pieces. Morale shattered, mutinies flared, supplies dwindled. The home front, starved by years of blockade and war economy, was unraveling. Food riots broke out in German cities. Revolution whispered in the streets. The people no longer wanted to fight. The soldiers no longer believed in victory. Austria-Hungary, Germany's ally since the start, was already crumbling. Its empire, a fragile collection of nationalities, had begun to disintegrate from within. Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, and Slovenes declared their independence. The empire's armies, drawn from so many different regions, fragmented as loyalties shifted. In October, the Austro-Hungarian High Command admitted it could no longer continue the war. It sought an armistice, not as a negotiating power, but as a failing state. Within weeks, the empire was no more, its old order swept away by a tide of national self-determination that could not be reversed. In the Ottoman Empire, defeat had already come. British and Arab forces had captured Damascus. The empire's territory was vanishing piece by piece. And in Bulgaria, unrest brought the war effort to a standstill. Ally after ally dropped away, leaving Germany isolated and exposed. The once powerful Central Powers had become a dwindling circle. In the final weeks, as October turned into November, Germany itself began to unravel. Naval mutinies broke out in Kiel. Soldiers refused to follow orders. Workers went on strike. Across the country, a revolution was growing. The people were no longer merely tired, they were done. On November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled into exile. The German Empire, proclaimed in Versailles in 1871, after the Franco-Prussian War, came to a sudden quiet end. A republic was declared. And with no government willing to continue, Germany asked for peace. 2 days later, in the early hours of November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. The terms were harsh, though not as harsh as what would come later. Germany was to withdraw from all occupied territory. Weapons would be surrendered. The war would stop, not immediately, but at the agreed time, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Until that exact moment, the guns would continue to fire. And so, in those last hours, knowing the war was ending, thousands still died. Orders were still followed. Battles were still fought. Men charged across fields, not for victory, but because the command had already been given, and the machinery of war does not halt simply because a clock is ticking. There was no grand ceremony, no trumpet call, just a moment when, after 4 years of thunder, the world went still. Silence fell across the front like a blanket. Soldiers emerged from trenches and stared across the desolation, stunned. Some wept, some stood in disbelief, some simply sat down, as though only now realizing how tired they truly were. The war was over, but what remained was not peace. It was something else, quieter, more uncertain, a waiting period, a breath before the reckoning began. The world had lost over 16 million lives. 20 million more were wounded. An entire generation of young men had vanished into the earth. Empires had collapsed. Monarchies had fallen. Economies were broken. Families were fractured. And the world, once so certain of its future, now stood blinking in the ash-covered light of something new and unknown. The end had come, not with glory, but with exhaustion. The war had not been won in the traditional sense. It had been outlasted, fought to the point where no one could bear it any longer. The victors were scarred, the defeated were devastated, and yet the world turned forward. The silence of November 11th would not last. It was the closing of one chapter. But already, the next was beginning to write itself, not with hope, but with the heavy, lingering question of what came next. The war was over, but peace did not arrive like a warm wind after a long storm. It came with the weight of uncertainty, of grief, of promises that could not be kept, and questions that no treaty could fully answer. Europe stood broken, its cities battered, its fields churned into mud and bone, its people hollowed by loss. Millions had died, millions more were maimed in body or in mind, and an entire generation had grown up too fast or never grown up at all. The world had changed, not only in borders or governments, but in its very understanding of what was possible, of how much destruction a single war could cause, and how fragile the civilization that had once seemed eternal truly was. In Paris, the victors gathered to shape the future. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, was the centerpiece of their efforts to rebuild the world. But it was not a treaty built on forgiveness or understanding. It was built on exhaustion, on anger, on the desire to punish and to ensure that such a war could never happen again. At its heart was Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, which placed full responsibility for the conflict on Germany and its allies. Germany was to pay enormous reparations, payments so vast they would haunt its economy for decades. It was stripped of its colonies, its navy, large parts of its army, and significant territory. The Rhineland was demilitarized. The Saar was placed under League of Nations control. The treaty redrew the map of Europe, carving new nations from old empires, creating borders that looked neat on paper, but ignored the tangled lives and loyalties of the people who lived within them. Austria-Hungary, once sprawling and patchwork, was dissolved entirely. In its place arose Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia. Poland re-emerged from over a century of partitions, given access to the sea via the Polish corridor, which cut into German territory and separated East Prussia from the rest of the country. The Ottoman Empire, too, was carved apart. France and Britain divided its Arab lands between themselves in secret agreements, creating new mandates in Syria, Iraq, Palestine, and elsewhere. These lines, drawn by foreign hands, would become the source of decades of conflict. Italy, though on the winning side, felt cheated of the territorial gains it had been promised, an anger that festered in the years to come. The idea behind many of these changes was to give peoples the right to self-determination, to allow ethnic and national groups to govern themselves. But in practice, the treaties created new minorities, new resentments, new tensions. Millions of people found themselves citizens of new nations that spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and did not welcome them as equals. Old hatreds were not erased, they were simply rearranged. And yet, alongside punishment, there was also hope. The League of Nations was born from the dream of collective security, a new diplomatic order that could settle disputes before they became wars. It was the vision of US President Woodrow Wilson, who had traveled to Europe with his famous 14 points, a list of ideals for a fair, lasting peace, open diplomacy, free trade, disarmament, national self-determination, a general association of nations to preserve peace. Wilson believed the world had learned its lesson, that the horror of the Great War would give birth to a new age of reason. But the League was flawed from the start. The United States, whose president had created it, never joined. Congress refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. Many in America wanted no more entanglements in European affairs. Without the participation of its most powerful architect, the League was weakened from the beginning, its authority often symbolic, its decisions ignored by those who did not wish to be bound. Across Europe, returning soldiers struggled to find their place. The victory parades could not erase the memories of mud and wire, of comrades buried in anonymous graves. Men with missing limbs walked the streets. Others carried their wounds within, silent, frightened, changed. Psychological trauma, now recognized as post-traumatic stress, was poorly understood. Many were dismissed as weak, their suffering hidden behind walls of shame and silence. Hospitals overflowed. Mental institutions became warehouses for those who could not adjust. Families were left to piece together the men who had returned, or to mourn those who never did. Women, too, found themselves caught in a strange moment of change. During the war, they had worked, led, and kept entire nations running. Now, in peacetime, many were expected to return to traditional roles. Some did, others refused. The war had opened doors, shown what was possible. Suffrage movements gained momentum. In several countries, women gained the right to vote. Their voices, once confined to the domestic sphere, had grown louder, more insistent. They had earned a place in the public world, and many were not willing to give it up. The economy, once driven by war production, faltered. In Germany, inflation began to spiral. By the early 1920s, the mark was worthless. Entire savings destroyed overnight. Workers were paid in wheelbarrows of money. Bread cost millions. Hunger returned. Unemployment soared. These were the seeds of something dangerous, though few yet saw how deep they would grow. In Russia, the revolution had birthed a new kind of state, communist, uncompromising, and determined to spread its ideals. Civil war continued to rage there, even as the rest of Europe tried to rebuild. In Italy, dissatisfaction festered. Veterans returned to poverty and political chaos. From that instability, new voices rose, loud, angry, and promising order through force. Peace, in name only, reigned, but beneath its surface lay fault lines that trembled with every year that passed. The war had ended, but the world had not healed. In the arts, in literature, and in philosophy, a sense of disillusionment bloomed. The war had not been glorious. It had been mechanized, impersonal, absurd. Writers spoke of a lost generation. Painters abandoned realism. Musicians experimented with dissonance. The old certainties had been shattered. The age of empires was over. The age of ideologies was beginning. Monuments were built. Cemeteries were filled. Memorials etched names into stone. So many names. Towns lost half their young men. Whole villages were left without a generation. In Britain, the tomb of the unknown warrior was created to honor those whose bodies were never identified. In France, beneath the Arc de Triomphe, An eternal flame burned for the nameless dead. Across the world, silence became a ritual. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, people paused, heads bowed, church bells tolled. And in that silence, the world tried to remember what it had done, what it had lost, and what it must never allow again. But memory is fragile. The peace of 1919 was not built on reconciliation. It was built on the rubble of bitterness and fear. It offered structure, but not stability, vision, but not unity. And as the 1920s unfolded, first with hope, then with tension, the world would begin to understand that this was not the end of something, but the beginning of something else. A fragile peace, resting on the thinnest of ice, and beneath it, the deep, cold waters of unfinished conflict. The guns had fallen silent, but the echoes of the war carried on, in the minds of those who fought, in the homes that had been emptied, and in the world that now struggled to understand what it had endured. The Great War had ended, but its story had not. It lived on in silence, in memorials, in politics, in landscapes that would never quite recover. It lived on in memory, and just as powerfully, in sleep. The kind of sleep broken by distant thunder that isn't thunder at all, by dreams where boots crunch on frozen ground, by voices that whisper names lost to time. For those who had lived through it, the war continued behind closed eyes. In the years that followed, people tried to sleep again, to rest, to rebuild lives that had been shattered, but the world they awoke to each morning was not the one they had known before 1914. For millions of veterans, returning home did not mean returning to who they had been. The rhythms of civilian life were slow, confusing, even alien. A man who had spent years measuring time by whistles and shell bursts could not easily adjust to the tick of a clock in a quiet room. Cities had changed. Families had changed. The men themselves had changed. The war had carved deep into the psyche of an entire generation, and its scars could not be seen in photographs or on medals. Some tried to forget. They closed the door to their past, spoke little of the war, buried uniforms and letters in attic boxes. Others clung to the memories, unable or unwilling to let them go. Regiments kept in touch. Reunion dinners were held. Poppies bloomed each November, but remembrance was not always healing. For some, it reopened wounds. For others, it preserved the only time in their lives when they had felt truly alive, even amidst death. There were men who returned home only to feel more lost than they ever did in the trenches. There were those who laughed in company and cried alone, who woke at night reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, who could not bear fireworks or loud engines or the sudden slam of a door. The war had woven itself into their sleep. Even for those who had not fought, the war left a presence that could not be named. Children who had grown up with fathers at the front became adults in a world that had no patience for their questions. Mothers who had written letters each night sat in quiet kitchens, their sons gone forever. Wives who had learned to live alone sometimes found they did not know the men who returned. Entire communities carried silence like a second language. The gap between the living and the dead was not always filled by words. Often, it was filled by silence. The kind that settles between two people who no longer know how to speak of the thing that changed them both. Sleep itself became different. The kind of sleep that came after years of shellfire was often light, fractured, and haunted. Doctors spoke of nerves, of hysteria, of war trauma. Some prescribed rest, others prescribed silence. In some cases, men were institutionalized for decades, diagnosed with conditions no one had language for. The war had reached into the human mind and torn something loose, something fragile and essential, and though time passed, it did not erase what had been broken. In dreams, the past still marched in uniform, still called roll call, still waited for the next barrage. But even in this long shadow, people found ways to reclaim peace. In art, in poetry, in music, they gave voice to what could not be said in conversation. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote lines that carried the weight of memory and the bitterness of truth. Painters abandoned romantic images of battle and instead showed the world as it truly was, muddy, twisted, and scarred. The war reshaped imagination as much as it reshaped geography. It changed how stories were told, how heroes were remembered, and how dreams were interpreted. And the war also reshaped time itself. Before 1914, the world had measured its progress in years of peace, in royal reigns, in industrial milestones. After the war, time was split in two, before and after. The war became the pivot around which the modern world turned. Every political decision, every cultural movement, every flicker of rebellion or reform carried its shadow. Even sleep became a political space. In the years that followed, totalitarian ideologies rose in part by offering certainty, a sense of control in a world that had spun too far into chaos. People were drawn to strong voices, firm promises, easy answers. They wanted rest, they wanted peace, but the peace they had was fragile, and the rest they sought would not last. Still, in the quiet spaces, people dreamed. They dreamed of gardens, of normal days, of laughter in kitchens and songs sung without fear. They planted trees in fields that had once been craters. They lit candles in churches and read old letters in silence. They rebuilt what they could. And in those moments, those slow, soft, ordinary moments, they found pieces of something that felt like healing. It was not complete. It was never complete, but it was something. Over the decades, the war receded into history. The uniforms became artifacts. The veterans grew older, their voices softer, their memories more distant. But the sleep of the world still held their stories, in bedtime tales and history books, in whispered prayers and classroom lessons, in the solemn silence of Armistice Day. The war lived on, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what had been lost, of what must be remembered. And so tonight, as you drift into sleep, know that you are part of that long, gentle story, a story of resilience and silence, of noise that became stillness, of wounds that never fully closed, and of a world that, somehow, kept turning. Let the echoes fade. Let the names rest. Let the century close its eyes once more. The war is over. The night is long. And peace, at last, is near.